opportunity. We're going to record, just so you know. And also an opportunity for us to reflect and hold ourselves accountable for continued sustainability progress. In this forum, we're joined by three very special guests who are members of Dartmouth's senior leadership team and have a hand in Dartmouth stepping forward as a sustainability leader. And they are here to share their thoughts on Dartmouth sustainability progress, opportunities, and challenges. Just a few little logistics. On Zoom, joined by a Zoom audience, we ask that people stay muted until the last 20 minutes of the event. And for those of you both on Zoom and in person, we will have an opportunity for questions at the end, at the last 20 minutes or so. So hold your questions and ask them then. And with that, I think I will turn to our panel and ask them to introduce themselves in 2 minutes or less. Please briefly explain your role at the college and how your professional life or background has intersected with sustainability. Maybe starting with Rick and going this way.
Sure.
Great.
So I'm Rick Mills. I'm Executive Vice President at Dartmouth, which is sort of the lead administrative position, partnered with Dave in the lead academic position as provost. What's my background? I went to Hamilton College. I was a history major. I went to law school and had the misfortune to become a litigator doing construction litigation, which led me to the job that probably most connected me to sustainability originally, which was at a place called Massachusetts Water Resources Authority in Boston that was cleaning up Boston Harbor. But I actually got assigned to take over the residuals management program, which is a nice word for sewage sludge. And we were digesting sewage sludge, creating gas and thinking about how we used it to fire both the digesters that digested the sludge, but also how could we use it to heat dry the sludge and ship it out as fertilizer and beneficially reuse it instead of discharging it into Boston Harbor, which is what they had done for hundreds of years. Somehow I got from managing sewage sludge in Boston Harbor to Harvard Medical School, where I was an administrative dean, and then to Dartmouth, where I became executive vice president. And I think I did that in 2 minutes.
Hi, everyone. Josh Keniston. I'm the vice president of campus services. So our all of our facilities and construction are in my division, which includes our power plant, which of course has a really big impact on our carbon emissions. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about it on kind of a day-to-day basis. My time at Dartmouth, my very first project that I worked on here was starting to think about how do we transition our energy source. And we're still working on it today. The pandemic, I think, kind of distracted us for a little bit, but we are focused and back at it and excited to be talking about it today.
Thanks. I don't have nearly the distinguished background of my colleagues here in terms of sustainability. I'm a Dartmouth 86 and a professor of computer science and the provost, the chief academic officer, partner with Rick. And in that role, I have a role to play in the sustainability part of the story related to the academic mission of the college. Personally, I was involved very much with the Dartmouth Outing Club when I was a student here. I see a bunch of DOC people here today, which is great. And mostly in Cabinet Trail and to some degree in the Environmental Studies Club at the time. So
you can hang on to the mic because we're going to turn to you for the first question, which is, what is, from your perspective, Dartmouth's role as a leader in the global fight against climate change and towards sustainability? What's our moral responsibility? And given that prospective students increasingly care about this, what do you see as Dartmouth's sustainability opportunity related to our identity?
Yeah, great questions. So I guess I would see Dartmouth has an important role in at least 3 ways. First of all, to lead by example, to some things I'm sure Josh will be talking about, making our campus and our operations more sustainable. Second is to help develop solutions, whether those be engineering solutions or policy solutions, economic solutions, through our research activities at Dartmouth to help provide solutions for the world. And third is to educate tomorrow's leaders who will actually go out there and make the decisions or develop the solutions that will help the world be more sustainable and deal with challenges like climate change. And you asked about prospective students, right? And the degree to which sustainability perhaps could become or is already part of our identity. I mean, our motto or mascot is green. I mean, it's right there in our mascot. I guess it's hard to call a color a mascot, but that's what we have. And so I would say, yes, given our location, given our history, given our capabilities in terms of research and education, I see sustainability as a huge potential identity. And that's something that I think we have been playing up and can play up more.
Josh, we're going to turn to you for the next question.
Sure.
Since energy is kind of your thing, the campus is transitioning from a steam heating system to a hot water system. How does this serve our sustainability goals? What are the advantages of hot water? And what are the challenges of the transition? And then what opportunities does that transition create?
Sure. And actually, I think it's exciting to be in the West End, which is kind of one of the first places where we've really pushed forward on the transition from steam to hot water with a new line, a super efficient self-insulated pipe that kind of is running around down Old Tuck Drive that's providing hot water to the West End. So we're right in it, but the transition is really about efficiency and flexibility. So you lose a lot of energy in the steam process as you're distributing steam. And by using lower temperature hot water, we actually predict that we'll be able to, just by switching our distribution system, improve our overall efficiency by 20%, which is how we achieve some of our overall energy reduction goals. So there's an efficiency component of hot water that is a really important aspect of our strategy. The second piece is flexibility. And so with a steam system, it's a high pressure steam system. There's not a lot of opportunity to add heat into the system. We have a central plant and everything is kind of derived from that. And it requires really high intensity heat to generate the steam. By going to low temperature hot water, it becomes far more flexible. It becomes a more open system where you can actually experiment and add a bunch of different inputs to it, whether it's geothermal with heat pumps or solar thermal. Those are lower intensity forms of heat that you couldn't use those to generate steam. And so by switching over to hot water, it allows us to be much more flexible with what we adopt. And the ones I named are the ones we know today. I think we expect that over the coming decades, there will be new technologies that emerge. And every indication we have is that by moving to low temperature hot water, it will enable us to adopt those more easily than our current steam system. And then finally, it's more comfortable. If you live in any of our older buildings or work in any of our older buildings and hear the clink, 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 or you're opening your windows because you can't get the temperature quite right, that's thanks to steam. As we move to hot water, we won't have to do that. And obviously, when you are opening your window when it's -5 outside, like that, we just know that's not sustainable. And so I think switching to hot water will really enable that. You asked about the challenges. It requires us to go into a ton of our buildings. A lot of our buildings haven't been touched in decades. And coordinating that work and figuring out how do we get in, it's disruptive. It's pipes that are in the walls that we're going to have to pull out and replace. It's pipes that run across the green that we're going to have to dig up and replace. So I think there's a lot of work that goes into how do we sequence it, how do we coordinate it in a way so that we don't feel like we're all living in one big construction zone for the entire, the next 10 years or whatever it may be.
What percentage of buildings, just the sub question of that, what percentage of buildings do we have to go into to convert from steam to hot water? Do you have a sense for it?
I'm going to try and remember, but Abby, our director of engineering, is actually here. I think it's about 60%, right, Abby?
More than that, probably in the 98%, but fortunately, many of those buildings, it's just the mechanical room.
Right.
You don't have to go into
all the walls. It's a smaller number, but I thought it was like 60% that we actually go rip the walls out.
Right. So that represents a lot of disruption.
Yeah.
Rick, turning to you, aside from COVID, what has been the greatest challenge, which is obviously a minor hiccup, but what has been the greatest challenge in the past 5 years to sustainability? And what do you see as Dartmouth's sustainability opportunity? Particularly, what has the administration done to address critical challenges that impact sustainability? And how would you like Dartmouth to go after those opportunities?
That was like way more than one question.
I'm packing them in.
Well, let's start with the challenges. And, you know, Dave mentioned Big Green. We're Big Green, and yet we're burning number 6 fuel oil and using steam to heat the campus. It ain't so green. I think the challenge is that we've been here since 1769. We've built an infrastructure, some of which is hundreds of years old, including the steam system that's over 100 years old. It's not trivial to go undo all that and rework it. And can I be nerdy for a minute? Josh talked about the low temperature hot water. When you think about this, hot water or steam is just a way to move BTUs around campus with hot water. A unit of heat or energy, but let's just say it's units that we need to keep you warm. And when you think about moving from steam, which packs a lot of BTUs in a small amount of space, we can use smaller radiators, smaller pipes. The reason we have to go in is with low temperature hot water, we need much more radiating space to get the BTUs out of the low temperature hot water and keep the room comfortable. So, I mean, I think when we go to what are the challenges, it's not challenges from 4 or 5 years ago, it's challenges from Dartmouth's origin. We have lots of older buildings, they're not well insulated, they have old systems in them, they're smaller, they have more radiating surface area than they have living space. So it's not the perfect campus to try to make sustainable. And I think that, coupled with just the fact that, as Dave said, I mean, our primary goals here, we want to be sustainable. We have to be sustainable, but we're here to do teaching and research. And teaching and research has a bunch of competing aspirations and missions that also need funding. So it's not just how do we fund getting sustainable, it's how do we fund getting sustainable and being sustainable while we're also continuing to advance our teaching and research mission. And even though we just had incredible endowment returns, we don't have enough money to do everything we want to do across all of those dimensions. And, you know, I think in the end, that's probably the single biggest challenge is how do we think about allocating resources to teaching and research missions and to converting this campus to be fully sustainable? And we have to. I mean, we now have an institutional goal. What have we done as leadership? President Hanlon is committed to the 2025 goal, the 2050 goal, and we're actually investing in making those changes to get there. When you read the IPCC reports, we need to do it faster. We need to spend more money sooner and get going on that. But when we do that, that means how do we advance our teaching and research mission? How do we keep you all being taught by top faculty doing cutting edge research, some research of which will be useful in policies or science to help advance sustainability. So I think that's what it boils down to, is that tension between how do you spend your money to have the most impact on sustainability as an institution, both as leading by example, but also continuing to advance teaching and research in those dimensions. And this building that we're sitting in the Irving project is a great example of a commitment to spend some money that didn't necessarily reduce it. It is a sustainable building, but it didn't reduce our total energy usage on campus, but it did provide a space where some of that teaching and research work can advance that will keep us moving ahead at the same time. And now I don't remember all the other parts of your question.
Well, you provided the perfect segue to my next question, which is actually for Dave. So I'm going to go ahead and take the segue. It has been 5 years since the Our Green Future report was released, Dave, as you know, and the planet is changing fast. Given the IPCC report that Rick mentioned, which essentially states that we're running out of time to act on and avoid the worst effects of catastrophic climate change, are our goals aggressive enough? If you could, with a magic wand, set our goals, would you set them more aggressively, or how would you manage that balance that Rick is talking about?
Yeah, this is the perfect day to ask that question, not just because it's Earth Day, but because, as I hope many of you saw, that President Hanlon announced or remarked on that Our Green Future report and talked about our efforts, your efforts to update it. I was reading it again just earlier this week, and the nice thing about the report is that, in my opinion, there are some core principles there that are still very meaningful, and I don't think necessarily would have to change. The specific goals and targets, yes, they probably need to be changed, either because after 5 years, we now have a better understanding of certain of the issues that help us to better set goals, and because the IPCC report has raised the stakes, if you will, and made it even more important that we be more aggressive. I'm not going to wave my magic wand and try to say what those goals should be, because frankly, that's an important process that these working groups will be putting together, drawing on input from the community, from you all, from the faculty, from the students, from the staff, from other experts, to help us collectively identify what those goals should be and how we can get there.
Rick, now I'm going to give you what you've always wanted, which is the magic wand. If you had the magic wand, how would you set those goals?
Yeah, I don't have a magic wand, but I can tell you that when Josh and I talk about this, our goal is to get to zero combustion and do it as fast as we can. It's clear that's where we need to get and where we need to go. And we're going to have goals and timelines that we can measure our progress and we can achieve, but the endpoint's got to be no carbon emission, no combustion. And it's just a matter of what are the things we can put in place now to make that happen as soon as possible, and that we can continue to adapt to the technology innovations that are out there.
Given our older building stock, could you talk a little bit about, this is a little bit off script, but could you talk a little bit about efficiency and the extent to which that plays a role as we think about our building stock and that, from 1769 to today?
Yeah, it makes me think of sort of scoring diving competitions, because to me, the efficiency is.
It's interesting because it doesn't immediately come to my mind.
All right, so let me talk you through it, Rosie, because you probably missed this in the sustainability program. No, it's that the more efficient we are, the easier it is to achieve a goal. So we can be inefficient and still achieve zero combustion, zero carbon emission. It's going to be expensive and it's going to be hard, but it's achievable. It's like the degree of difficulty got harder, but you could theoretically do it. So, I think for Dartmouth, part of it is you look at Dartmouth Hall, you look at Dart Row, you look at the iconic buildings on campus. How far can we take them in building envelope and technologies to make them more efficient? And then at what point do we say these buildings are part of our identity and we're going to hold on to them and we're going to bite the bullet and do power purchase agreements, which is going to come up later, or build more solar so that we can support powering or being warm in those buildings, even while not combusting. And it also is going to be nice to take down older buildings or reskin them in a way that makes them more efficient. It's just some buildings on our campus, we're never going to be able to touch them that way.
Anonymous Hall being an example of a reskinned building that we made radically more efficient.
Right, but it doesn't look much like what it started out as, and that would be hard to do to Baker Berry or, et cetera.
In that case.
Pardon?
The fact that it doesn't look like it used to is not a big.
Yeah, that might be an advance for that particular building.
That's true. Actually, the worst part of it was the sculpture that used to hang on it, that whatever
Yeah,
that thing.
that was Gilman, I think, right? That had the
Was-
bug on the side.
Oh, God.
Hopefully the sculptor's not in the room.
Sorry.
Could you
This
talk
is why
a
they
little-
don't allow me out much, actually.
So we use energy in a variety of ways, a variety of types of energy. You can hold on to it because you're going to answer
You're
this
still
one
on the
too.
hotspot.
And one, we talked a lot about heat, but let's talk a little bit about electricity. So Dartmouth also consumes a fair amount of electricity. Could we buy renewable electricity? How easy is that to do? And what are those mechanisms?
Super easy
For
to
the
do.
benefit of the group.
We could do it today. We could buy all of our energy through what are called virtual power purchase agreements, VPPAs, that essentially would say we're committing to solar electricity. I'm not sure, when you think about this resource question and the sequence and timing, that may not be the best way to get our campus to sustainable goals in the long run. It may be better to do the conversion from steam to hot water and use the money that we would have spent on the VPPA in the near term to do that conversion, and then think about how you layer in those expenditures versus your other opportunities to improve the sustainability of campus. And it's always a choice, it's always a trade-off. Some things sound great or would be great sound bites, but might actually slow down the progress on getting the campus to a fully sustainable point. But if you ask me, there are VPPAs in our future. It's a matter of when and how much power. And to your point around efficiency, they get much more effective when we're using less energy, as we're getting more efficient. And the other question is, it's great if we're helping build a solar project in Arizona that might be what feeds this power purchase agreement. That's not as great as managing our energy needs locally and figuring out how we can do it here with resources here. And so it's a constant evaluation of trade-offs.
I don't know whether this is best to Josh or to you, Rick, but what are our opportunities to support the town of Hanover and the Upper Valley as the town of Hanover and the region move to greater sustainability, and how can Dartmouth participate in that transition?
I've been talking too much and Josh has a much better voice, so I'll let Josh do that.
I think there are a couple of ways. One, we've already been working with the town of Hanover, helping enable some of the work that they were doing at their, the installation that they did with their solar project. I think continuing to coordinate with the town. Obviously, we're one of the biggest users of electricity in Hanover. And so to the extent that the town has a goal for 2030, I think there's a real opportunity for us to be part of achieving that goal, and continuing to work with the town to find ways, to have synergy and to share ideas. Right before the pandemic, we actually took a trip with a delegation from the town to Denmark to go understand, how some of the European countries that are kind of, or Scandinavian countries that are quite a bit ahead of us in terms of some of this thinking. And I think that really has informed some of the work that we're doing in terms of how we think about hot water, how we think about the energy sources that are going to feed it. So I think there's a nice partnership there that we've had and kind of will continue to rely on as we both trying to accomplish our goals.
And can I add something to that, which is, I think all of the things we're thinking about doing are going to involve land use questions, zoning questions, as we're building solar arrays, or we're putting in geothermal well fields, or building a geothermal plant site, or putting in a geothermal storage tank. That's going to require collaboration with the town around how do we site it, how do we work with neighbors, how do we make it so that these sorts of conversions, which it's a little bit like when people complain about wind turbines and I don't like what it looks like, or it's disrupting my view. But if we're really committed to getting to these goals, we're going to have to readjust how we think about some of those things. And the only way that's going to happen is collaborating with the town.
Yeah, there's some not only financial trade-offs, but also trade-offs in terms of land use and being willing to have some of our energy generation live with us, right? Some of our energy storage live with us in a way that I think most American communities have not done. Many American communities have not done. They've outsourced it to somewhere away. Josh, I'll stay with you for a minute in terms of the relationship between sustainability or improved sustainability and resiliency. One of the things that we've seen in the Upper Valley is the impact of climate change being expressed as extreme weather events, mostly in our region in the form of flooding, and these storms that dump an enormous amount of water, particularly in the spring and fall. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between sustainability and improving Dartmouth sustainability and improving Dartmouth's resiliency? We know it's really important that we're able to keep students warm and dry and fed in the event of a supply interruption, for example, and also that we're able to keep research safe in the event of some kind of disruption. If we have ice cores in a freezer and we aren't able to keep them cold, that can be a really impactful event for a researcher. So could you talk a little bit about the relationship between those two things?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. So one, as we're doing new construction projects or we're doing major renovations, I think we are keeping resiliency in the back of our mind, whether it's how we design, stormwater systems, or how we, insulate the buildings and, how long, they can kind of operate without heat because they can, retain enough energy to kind of hit some of our standards. So, a lot of the work that we're doing as we design, we call them high performance buildings, really help on that front, both kind of inside the building, but also as we think about dealing with stormwater and some of the kind of other aspects that you talked about. But as Rick mentioned, and as you're kind of alluding to, this is one of our challenges. And as we think about moving to hot water, or moving to more electric-based forms of heat, whether it's running heat pumps or just pumps to move around, water that's coming from a solar thermal array, it makes us really reliant on electricity. And in a backup situation, oftentimes the option you have is a diesel generator. And so I think we are having to do a lot of really hard thinking about how do we balance all of that, and how do we think about designing our buildings in ways that aren't going to be overly reliant on some of those systems. But there are parts of that we don't have fully solved right now, as we think about how to be resilient. But it's something that's really important. It's kind of been baked into our process as we think about any of our new projects.
So we currently at Dartmouth measure our scope 1 emissions and our scope 2 emissions. Those are the emissions that we generate here at the college by burning fuel, and the emissions associated with the electricity we purchase. An area that we in the sustainability office are starting to kind of get our arms around, which is a big bucket of things, is what's called our scope 3 emissions, which is all of the emissions associated with the food supply chain for FOCO, all the materials that we purchase, transportation, flying to your FSP, all of that. As we think about those emissions, could you talk a little bit about how you think about scope 3 emissions, why we've so far excluded them? If you know, I'm happy to jump in there if that's helpful. And what do you see as the opportunities for operational improvements on scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, and I mean, you can talk more about kind of from the 2017, our Green Future report, kind of said scope 3 is in the future. And I think we had talked about 2020 as being that future. And obviously we're not there yet. A little behind. I think that the big challenge is you just listed a bunch of different categories that are really hard to kind of wrap your hands around. And you rely a lot on kind of external partners to be doing their part. And I think that is one of the challenges with scope 3 is, we need society and, both locally and more broadly to be making advances on this to really be able to address some of our scope 3 emissions. So I know we're not reporting on it yet, and I suspect that as we do this kind of, revised, updated report, we will find that doing more reporting on scope 3 is one of the things that ends up being part of that conversation and that we think about. But even though we're not reporting on it, it becomes an important part of all the decisions that we make. One of the ones that we're thinking about right now is we're leveraging shuttles more and more on campus. And so we're having a conversation right now about how do we think about a long-term transportation plan on the combustion engine. And again, this is an area where there are challenges, but we're seeing some really quick advancements. One of the problems right now is there are not electric buses that can kind of do, a 14-hour shift. And so how do we solve for that? And I think those are the things that, we're starting to do the thinking on that. And I think the solution is probably not next month, but I think the solution is out there in the next couple of years. And so as we start to do some of this longer term planning, we're keeping an eye on those scope 3 emission pieces and wanting to make sure that decisions that we make today and some of the planning that we're setting up are prepared to account for those.
One of the things that I find really interesting about scope 3 emissions as we look at those impacts for Dartmouth is they kind of all fall in, both the initial cost and the emissions all fall into your bucket, Rick, in terms of management. So an example of that might be, as we look at the transportation system and transportation related emissions, we are paying to produce and maintain parking spots, or folks who report up through you are buying $130 million a year or some number like that of stuff, physical stuff, and you're responsible for the waste system that is dealing with that physical stuff at the end of the supply chain. So that's kind of this interesting, are there ways we can capture efficiencies within that bucket? I don't know if you have any thoughts on scope 3 emissions and some of those kind of left-hand pays or left-hand buys and right-hand pays kind of situations.
Yeah, I mean, nothing that's going to be brilliant or insightful or new, unfortunately. I think mostly that it is to Josh's point, there's a time element to this around the evolution of both markets and products and society that is going to enable us to do more on that. But there are also things we can probably begin to do today, thinking more about food supply and what we can source locally, which changes some of the transportation consequences and impacts of our food, thinking about handling waste with more on-site composting and incorporating composting into our landscaping and maintenance programs. I mean, we can start to nibble at the edges, which I think if we take it on, we'll begin to actually have impact. I also think it will help socialize with the community the sorts of things we need to do. We need to bring the community along with us as we go on that journey. And you know, when we think about scope 3 emissions and just sourcing the materials that we use to make our campus more sustainable, lots of them come from very far away. And whether it's solar panels from China or even just the hardware in this building, there are consequences and costs associated with trying to source those closer to home. Sometimes they're just not available because of the raw materials or the production, but it's incredibly complicated. And I think that's probably part of why source 3 emissions got pushed out a little, scope 3 got pushed out a little further, and why we're behind. It's going to be the hardest part of this equation.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that all of our peers are trying to wrap their arms around too. As you can imagine, accounting for scope 3 emissions involves many data points, and you have to collect data really differently than you might for gallons of fuel oil that we purchase, that kind of thing. If you're trying to figure out where every Dartmouth employee comes from, what kind of car they commute in, and how they, you know, how they're getting to campus, how often they're driving versus carpooling, it gets really complicated really fast. Or the supply chain emissions of your hamburger or your whatever, your something you got at FOCO. And there's all kinds of interesting nuanced challenges that come back to customer preference, which is not true if you think about the energy system. So as long as Josh makes sure that every outlet at Dartmouth works and the lights are on and you're heated and comfortable, most people are satisfied with electricity service or energy service. But if we change something in FOCO, many people are dissatisfied very quickly, right? Or if we change parking, that's an even bigger thing. Many people respond very quickly. So you're starting to get into consumer preference. One interesting puzzle we're working on is students get 160,000 packages a year. That's a lot of packages that come through the HBs, and there's a lot of waste associated with those packages. So we're trying to think about how do we manage for that without changing your ability to order things on Amazon.
But Rosie, I think some of this starts with what you're going to do, which is beginning to account for those scope 3 emissions and just raise the level of awareness about where are our biggest source of scope 3 impacts. And let's look at the list and start saying, what can we pick off? But if we're not aware of what we're doing, we're not going to address it.
Yes, and that's, I'm counting on Marcus to do that in our office in the sustainability core. So that should keep us busy for the next while. We have the opportunity now to turn to all of you and also to our audience for some questions.
I
Why
have a
don't we
quick
go ahead?
one, which is resiliency really a word? Why isn't it just resilience?
Resiliency is a word. I don't know.
But-
Is there
but-
an English major in the room? No, I'm actually an English major.
It seems like it's just resilience, but whatever.
Rick often asks questions that I don't have the answer to, and that's one. So I think I'm going to move around the room with this mic and hand it to people. Is that the right thing? So does anybody have a question in the room? And Abby, are you going to look online? Okay. Anyone in the room have a question? Yeah.
Is this already? Yes, this is on. Are there any plans to work with the Greek spaces on campus with regards to developing a more sustainable future for Dartmouth? Because that represents tens of thousands of square feet, which are not directly owned by Dartmouth College, but I imagine are still a relatively high energy use intensity, considering that a lot of the buildings are relatively old. Are there any plans in regards to that at all?
I can answer that a little bit, and maybe you guys can think about it. So we have, there have been various evolutions in engagement with Greek houses over my time at Dartmouth, including periods of time where we had interns who were working with the Greek system, and we identified representatives in every house, and where we had houses participating in energy efficiency renovations. We found there was a lot of variability in houses because they're all managed slightly differently. For example, some use Dartmouth waste pickup, but they're owned independently. Some are Dartmouth owned and use all Dartmouth utilities. Some are kind of funny hybrid of the two, and some are completely independent and have like a #2 boiler in the basement. So we found it was really difficult to have a unified program across all the Greek houses, but there have been programs in the past where Greek houses have applied for and gotten funding, for example, to improve efficiency in their houses. And it could be something that we come back to. I don't know if anyone has anything to add.
So they're not currently in place.
Well, it depends on, it's complicated because it depends on your house. So if your house is independent, there are state incentives and there are programs that we can help you get access to that will provide funding for efficiency improvements in your house. If your house is Dartmouth owned, Dartmouth has invested a lot in improving efficiency of many of those houses. So it kind of depends on your house. No.
I mean, the only thing I would add is we've also done loan programs with houses that we don't own, but letting the fraternity or sorority borrow money from Dartmouth to do renewal, often efficiency renewals and insulation and that sort of thing.
Do you think that that kind of thing would, we've had mixed results in the past. Do you think that kind of thing would motivate houses to improve their efficiency if there was funds available?
I think it's really dependent on the specific house because the culture is different, but I can speak at least.
Sorry, realize that.
I can speak at least from Phi-Tau's perspective that we would be greatly interested in borrowing money to, because we're currently self-funding our own renovations. So
Okay.
we're going to do it whether or not you give us money or not.
Cool.
So Josh, earlier you mentioned that upwards of 60% of the campus building stock is going to have these fairly intrusive renovations to improve like the heating systems. And so while you're in there with the walls peeled back, is there a plan to improve the installation of these buildings? And if not, why?
Oh, there's definitely a plan to improve it. I mean, we kind of talked about this a little bit in a couple of our comments, but in our plan, I kind of think of our plan as three components. The distribution, right? So the conversion from steam to hot water is one component. How we're actually producing the heat or producing the cooling is another component, which right now is largely number 6 on electricity, but we're looking at solar thermal, geothermal. The third piece, and the one that is like an absolute no-brainer, and it's the one that is going to serve future generations, is efficiency and improving building envelopes. We've referenced a couple of times Dartmouth Hall. I mean, this is one that is one of the more challenging buildings. It is iconic, and so we're limited in terms of what we can do to the exterior. But the team worked really hard to figure out, even with brick, which requires some heat to pass through so that it doesn't crack and break and crumble, how far can we push it? And we actually ended up spending, another $500,000 to add, it's not huge, but it's some in order to reduce the amount of energy that building's going to use. And so, different buildings have different opportunities, but we're going to take advantage of all of them.
Isn't it the case that when you replace the hot water, you're basically gut renovating the whole building anyway? Or-
It depends. So when Abby and I were just talking about that, some of the buildings that we have, the change happens just in the mechanical room. So there are a subset of buildings where for a lot of folks, you're not going to see it. For other buildings, it will literally be going in, and part of the work that our teams have been doing is figuring out how many bookcases are we going to have to rebuild, because that is going to be a really expensive time component piece of it. One of the things that we're doing, I mean, if we've been talking about housing renewal, right? Undergrad housing renewal. And so part of what we're doing with our sequencing is trying to line up some of the energy conversions with some of the broader renewal that we need to do in undergrad housing. And so when we go in, we'll take a building totally offline for say, 15 months. We'll do all of the envelope and change it from steam to hot water.
But I think, so John, this is getting into the nuances of things, but Josh just mentioned the brick. And one of the interesting things is with historic brick buildings, literally you can't over insulate, or you end up driving the freeze line in the brick to a point that the brick just starts to fracture, crumble, and the entire building kind of disintegrates over time. Counterintuitively, another thing that's interesting is if you put tons of insulation in the roof, suddenly you have no snow melt and the snow loads on the roof exceed the structural capacity of that building and that roof. So there are limiting factors to how much you can do, which kind of goes to, if it isn't an iconic building, at some time it would be nice to replace it with a modern high-performing building. There probably are going to be some iconic buildings that we save and we do as much as we can, but it's not as much as could be done with technology. It's just as much as can be done while you preserve the building.
The question back here.
I was going to ask the same exact question, so I'll ask something different. I'm interested in the
Ask
new.
the same one again.
I'm interested in the new addition to the hop and whether or not this building is focused on, you said typically with funds, we can either focus on academics or sustainability. So I was wondering if this building to you is more focused on academics or if sustainability was a something that you're focusing on for this and why it can't be both.
Well, I was actually going to say, I mean, I think we're hitting a nice balance on this one. We're spending, a very significant portion of the investment in the kind of basically the HVAC system. So the hop during this renovation, a lot of the work that we're doing is to upgrade the ventilation system to make it more efficient, to switch pieces of the building that aren't already on hot water to hot water. We've been spending a lot of time with the architects doing energy modeling to understand, how do we take some of these new parts of the building that are being added and making them as energy efficient as possible, and making sure that, at the end of the day, we're trying to reduce overall energy consumption and not add to it. And then I'll just add, I mean, if you dig into some of the details of the hop renovation, we're effectively adding, it's kind of a half dozen quote unquote new spaces. But a lot of that is through repurposing of and kind of improving overall layout. So 55,000 square feet of the renovation is actually repurposing old building, and only 15,000 is totally net new. And so part of what we've been trying to balance in this whole project is how do we take assets that we already have, how do we reuse aspects of the hop that are there, bring them forward, make them, technologically advanced for today's standards, but not necessarily have to build a whole new performing arts center. So I think this is actually a good example of how do you balance both? How do you move forward both the kind of academic mission and also tackle some of these bigger sustainability issues?
Just an interesting example of why it can be a challenge is the architectural and engineering team was really focused on sustainability for the hop. And yet they showed us this really cool depiction of what the front of the hop could look like. And they had a propane fired fire pit that would run all the time. And it's like, you know what, that's really cool, but that's probably a really bad idea. And it's so interesting that the team was doing really advanced things to reduce energy usage in the building and still plopped a propane powered fire pit in front.
Is now a good time to mention the one upstairs?
I didn't catch that one.
Anyone else? I'm gonna go here and then come back to you, okay?
Awesome. So you mentioned that one of the biggest challenges was essentially that the school is quite old and we have to retrofit a bunch of the buildings. But in my eyes, I kind of see the opportunity being that we have a lot of time and, hopefully the school will be around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So I kind of see that as a bigger upside than, the challenge we have at hand. My question is really surrounded around, do we have an action plan for net neutrality, both on an energy spectrum and also on a carbon perspective? And then if we don't, why is it that we're kind of lagging behind, and how can we be more inclusive and intentional, including people in the decision, besides just, us having to tease out these questions of the specifics of 90%, potential reductions in energy buildings?
So I would say we have a plan that gets us 80% of the way to no carbon, net zero. That last 20%, it's depending on how you look at it, it's that kind of peak, right? It's this days, it's that last little bit. That part is really hard to solve for. And, so do we have a plan for that today? No. Part of what we are planning for, though, is making the decisions today so that we're set up to adopt those changes and to adopt technology that will get us there. So, I mean, we have a plan. I think that the 2025 goals, the 2050 goals, I mean, those drive a lot of our work where we have every intention of, meeting the goals that are out there. And so I think, there's certainly an opportunity for us to continue to share more about what we're doing, but we do have a plan.
Yeah, I would point out that this is kind of an opportunity for you, if you're interested, since it seems you are, to participate in the working groups that were described in that email that went out today that Rosie is setting up to help Dartmouth refine its plans, right? And if you really want to dig into the weeds of all these details, I'm sure there are opportunities for internships or leave term projects or research projects that could help Dartmouth think more deeply about specific, approaches, both in the immediate term and in the longer term.
And we will post on our website an opportunity for feedback on the sustainability planning process. So that's one way you can get involved right away. I'm going to come back to you in 1 second. I'm going to go to an online question because we have them pouring in, and then we'll come back to the back row. Abby's going to be our online voice.
Yeah, we had a question about whether Dartmouth has considered putting solar farms on farmlands or the golf course as a way to get utility scale.
Yes, we have. We're just looking
and
at some. We've actually, we've been looking at some plans just this week, looking at what we can do with solar. And, I think it's one of the things that we kind of continue to iterate on and figure out what is the best combo.
Could you talk a little bit about the balance between solar PV and solar thermal? I think when most people say, can we do solar? They're talking about solar PV. But a thing that we have spent a lot of time thinking about is also solar thermal, since a lot of Dartmouth's energy demand is thermal energy. So I don't know if you want to mention that, Josh.
Yeah, I think a lot of our rooftop installations are solar PV. And part of that is because we haven't had great solar thermal, right? We have largely steam on campus, which solar thermal doesn't produce steam, so limited utility. As we start to think about the transition to hot water, that calculus starts to change. And so some of the plans that we're looking at now actually factor solar thermal in as a key aspect of pairing it with geothermal and as a way to keep geothermal wells balanced, right? Because one of the challenges you have with geothermal is if that you keep pulling out over time, they start to degrade and they don't offer kind of as much energy. The concept of you need to kind of insert as much heat as you're taking out. And so as we've started to look at the combination and pairing it with the work that we're doing with hot water, we've started to see that solar thermal could be an important part of that balance.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you, as you're making these plans, what do negotiations and just talks in general with the Board of Trustees of Dartmouth look like? So if the board is considering a new energy efficiency initiative, so have there been cases where, say, energy efficiency has taken priority over other projects or other ways to spend money? I know you have to balance research academics and sustainability, but could you tell us a little bit about how those discussions go and how do you manage everybody's different interests?
Yeah, one of the biggest things that the trustees have done recently is approve an extra distribution out of the endowment for something that's called the Infrastructure Renewal Fund. And that actually took the trustees coming to agreement to say, we're going to over distribute out of the endowment above the normal distribution rate. And they prioritized that money to help fund two things: the residential renewal project and the energy conversion to a sustainable future. And that was for me, that was a moment when the trustees really stepped into this in a way that when I first got here 9 years ago, I'm not sure they were ready to do. And this set of trustees, I think, has recognized that that transition is critically important, both for society, but also for Dartmouth as an institution to keep going and to be the leader that we want to be in sustainability and in higher education. And that was a big deal.
Represents a sort of fundamental shift in terms of thinking about our campus as an investment in Dartmouth's future.
Yeah, so building off that question and one that was asked earlier, Dartmouth, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're the only Ivy League institution that hasn't set a goal of net zero by or before 2050. And with that in mind, are there institutional structures that need to change? I mean, are our priorities fundamentally different from those other schools that have taken those steps and have set that goal? Is sustainability less of an institutional priority for us, and in your view, than for other peer schools?
So I'm going to speak to that a little bit before I give it over to whoever grabbed the mic, Rick. I think there is no peer that has a carbon neutrality goal or a net zero carbon goal who is not planning on doing it with a significant purchase of offsets. And so far, Dartmouth has decided not to purchase offsets. That's an interesting philosophical question, potentially debate. Some of our peers are doing really interesting things to procure offsets. For example, Duke has started an initiative where they're generating their own offsets. So they're actually funding and building projects to, for example, reduce methane emissions from local farms, capturing those carbon offsets, and then pig farming, I guess, is a big thing around Duke, and then bank those offsets to reduce Duke's emissions. But so far at Dartmouth, we have decided to stay focused on the emissions that we produce and reducing those emissions. I think it's a very interesting philosophical debate about whether we should include offsets, but there's no way to get to zero without doing that. So that's the reason why we do not have a zero goal.
I couldn't have said it better, but I think it's critically important. I mean, to me, we know where we need to get and we know what we need to do and we're going to get there. I think it's a question of how and how quickly. And I think the trustees have made, and leadership, and this is something you can revisit when you revisit goals. I mean, I think we're constantly looking at it. So as technology changes, it may get easier to accomplish it and we can more sincerely embrace the goal. I think we really wanted to stay away from offsets and other things because we wanted to fix our problem here, not just say we're going to continue to do something kind of nasty and solve it by paying for something somewhere else.
One of my concerns with offsets from the perspective of the Office of Sustainability is that it might lessen Rick's focus or Josh's focus or Dave's focus on what we're doing here. That there are cases where it would be, in fact, we could go right now and purchase offsets for less money than many of the things that we're talking about doing here that will transform Dartmouth's operations. But arguably, that wouldn't be a good expenditure of funds if Dartmouth is continuing to build systems that are emitting into the future. So I worry that if we shift to a zero goal, what we lose is a laser focus on really putting pressure on ourselves here to focus on things like radical efficiency, which is hard. Radical efficiency is not easy. And if there's an easier way out, take it. So I like keeping it hard.
Yeah, we have another question from the chat. 8 months ago, Dartmouth announced it would follow its peer institutions like Harvard and divest investments from fossil fuels. What progress has been made and what is the timeline for going fossil free?
I don't think we're the right people to answer. It's not in our world.
I can speak a little bit to this because I just had a conversation with a member of our investment team because we are working on completing our ASHE STARS review, which is the Sustainability Tracking and Assessment. What is it, Marcus? Sustainability Tracking and Rating Standard or something like that, rating system, which we do every 3 years. And there are questions related to our endowment in that process. And essentially, we have no direct investments in oil, gas, or coal right now, and we are continuing to disinvest as funds essentially reach their expiration point. But it takes, I would say, 5 to 10 years, something like that timeframe, to disinvest from all of those funds because you can't get out of them because you're contractually obligated until they expire. That was the sense that I got. Does that sound right, Marcus?
Yeah, I think there's something else that's important to add there. I can take a microphone.
This is Marcus Welker, who's in
Yeah.
charge of
Hi, everyone.
our admissions accounting and the food for today. So there's that.
So I think another important part of it is actually that the investment office is taking a more proactive approach as well. And it's not just pulling out of all of the different funds that may have fossil fuel or other sort of negative investments in them, but is actually using our investment opportunities as a tool for positive change. And sometimes that actually means investing in companies that are doing bad things so that the college and the funds that are in control of those organizations can actually push for that positive change. And I think that that's actually sort of a fundamental thing that the investment office is using as a way to make that positive change. That's slightly different than just pulling our funds out of all of those things.
We also had a really interesting discussion about how capital markets are changing and that capital markets are increasingly moving towards sustainable investment. And that's a thing that our endowment office is seeing as well.
So we've been talking a little bit about radical change and long-term investment in clean energy strategies. But can one of you talk me through why an obvious both economic and coal admission short-term plan might not be to invest in a bridge technology like natural gas or some other less emissive fossil fuel?
So we don't have natural gas easily accessible up here. We've in our central plant, we've looked at a lot of different options. Some will remember that we explored heavily a biomass option. We in previous years had explored whether or not there was a way to get natural gas up here. There's no pipeline, and building kind of the appropriate kind of tank farm to do that is not something that was economically viable. You know, one of the things that and Rick hit on this a little bit is, and Rosie, your comments as well. One of the things that we worry about is if we invest a lot in a bridge technology, that becomes money that we can't then use for the ultimate goal, right? And a lot of the technology investments that would need to be made have 30+ year life cycles. And so as we look at a lot of those options that are kind of in between, we ultimately have a hard time justifying investing in something that is going to have to last for 30 years that isn't where we actually want to be. There are a few things that we can do in the near term that we're continuing to look at. I think that we're on number 6, we could go to number 2. There's some other options that we continue to evaluate and look at that could be in our horizon. But some of those bigger ones that would take a lot of capital, I think ultimately distract us from getting to where we really want to be.
The other thing that I really worry about is inertia. That decisions are really hard. They're particularly hard, no offense to Dartmouth, for institutions like this one that are risk averse and relatively slow moving. So one of the things that I worried about with LNG and CNG and even biomass is that once that stuff was in the ground, once the pipes and wires and whatever tanks are in the ground, it's really hard to get off of it. And you find yourself on a bridge for 50 or 70 years, which is an awful long time for a bridge.
I also think dollars spent to convert to that might be better spent to reduce our energy usage overall, which will have a longer term impact. And I worry about that.
Yeah.
So we've mentioned a couple of times efforts that other institutions are undertaking. Obviously, sustainability is not an issue that Dartmouth faces exclusively. Are there any plans at the moment or any interest in collaboration between universities, either in the Ivy League or outside of it, to kind of share challenges, potential successes, et cetera?
So this is something that we do actively. We're part of an Ivy Plus sustainability consortium. And Rick is actually part of something called the Listening Post, which is a larger group of universities, EVPs that get together. And he might not know this yet, but sustainability is heavily featured on his May 2nd agenda at the Listening Post. So the Ivy Plus and Listening Post sustainability coordinator or directors have been getting together and planning for that and figuring out what kind of information can we give our EVPs to equip them to make sustainability decisions or decisions based on sustainability criteria. So that's the kind of thing we do often. We're also part of ASHE, which is a national organization. And we participate with our peers quite often. Just recently, Abby had a whole group from other colleges and universities coming to look at our heating system. Joanna just had a whole group from Washington University in St. Louis, we're coming
About higher ed, there's incredible sharing. It's great.
Yeah, I was just going to add that we're also part of a consortium of global energy institutes and centers around the world. And then on the MBA side, there's a consortium of peer schools called the Climate Cap, which we convene annually. It's eventually going to be ping-ponging internationally. I think COVID has slowed that down, but we just convened at Kellogg with 25 peer schools and over 300 MBAs to talk about all sorts of things related to the curriculum and the application of education into industry. So.
And we also participate in the International Sustainable Campus Network, the ISCN.
I would also say the international piece is important because, as Rosie mentioned or Josh mentioned, there are so many places that are well ahead of the US in adopting a bunch of these technologies. And when we went to Denmark, seeing what that country has done around sustainability, and when you realize that you're in a country that mostly is a few feet above sea level, they have a real reason to be invested in this. And they are well ahead of us. So we learned a lot just by making that kind of connection.
So Dartmouth now has 2 LEED Platinum certifiable lab buildings. And I was wondering if the LEED Platinum or LEED certification was considered when in the HOP construction, and if other sustainable certifications such as Living Building Challenge that are a little bit more advanced or like more challenging sustainable goals are considered for future Dartmouth projects.
Yeah, I mean, so we always are considering the kind of various targets. Our high performance building program, the cornerstone of the work that we do, and I think LEED provides a really solid foundation. I think there are ways to start chasing points in a way that's not always the most beneficial. And so one of the things that I think we've really kind of focused the majority of our energy on is how do we address, high performance building standards. Some of those are ones that kind of we develop in-house. Oftentimes it leads to then being able to get certified at these, LEED Platinum or LEED Silver, LEED Gold. For our buck. And, there are some times where we'll make a decision not to pursue a certain, LEED Platinum because we actually think that, in terms of investing more, for example, in the envelope that doesn't get us more points, but may actually reduce our energy overall is a good thing. So it's part of the kind of balancing act and calculus that we do for all of our new projects and all of our deep renovations.
We're gonna go to the internet.
Yeah, so we have another question. Thousands of climate scientists around the world in the past week have risked their careers and reputations in order to protest the inaction of many national governments surrounding climate change. While improving our own sustainability is great, there are larger systems at play. What can Dartmouth and other prestigious peer institutions do to support these academics and help advocates for action and policy changes at local, state, and national levels?
Question for the provost.
Well, it's a good question. And I would say it begins at home as before. In how can we support our academics, our scientists, our scholars in doing their work and in presenting and communicating their work to the broader world. And we have a lot of faculty here in engineering and in economics and environmental studies and in other departments who are working on the cutting edge and contributing to a lot of that science. I'm not aware personally of faculty at Dartmouth who are taking the kind of actions that you were just describing, that the questioner was just describing. But I would be very supportive of them if they want to do so.
Another question from Zoom.
Yeah, so we have a question about how Dartmouth is taking advantage of the new Energy Justice Clinic in its planning and implementation of energy goals.
That might be kind of up to me, I think. I think I'm just going to step out so the Zoomers can see me. Clearly, justice is a critical component of how we move forward on sustainability. And I think in the past, one that has not been given enough attention as we think about how the choices we make here at Dartmouth impact our surrounding communities and also the supply chain that we're connected to, et cetera. So I don't have a specific answer for that question, but I think as we are thinking about this planning effort, we are trying to weave in consideration of justice, equity, and inclusion at every turn. Another question in the room before we go.
Do you want me to add to that?
Yeah, sure. That'd be great.
I think this
April Sallis, take it away.
this program is particularly interesting and relevant to the intersection of the education mission and incorporating research, but applied research that can really move the needle nationally and hopefully globally. The Energy Justice Clinic has been a phenomenal resource to the local sustainability committee here in Hanover. And I think measuring and helping track and account for different types of programmatic approaches to the energy transition. And then also sort of paralleling that process, some of the broader regional efforts to increase clean energy access within the state and within the region, and leveraging the students, our students, to then go out and get the best in understanding of what's happening in California and other CCA community choice aggregations and things like that across the country. And I think we're really looking forward to the output of this research, because hopefully it will inform future committees across the country to do things slightly differently as we're considering this energy transition and who's affected. So I think, it's a really exciting way for us to see our research in an applied sense and hopefully to build upon a transition that looks more equal and just as we contemplate who benefits from the transition or who's affected if they're not included.
One thing that I think April's answer illustrates perfectly is the extent to which we have an awesome team here at Dartmouth. And many of the folks in this room are working on that team to make Dartmouth more sustainable, and all of you are as in your advocacy and in driving Dartmouth to be better. So I think that's really important. I think we'll go to Zoom for one final question and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, it's one pretty straightforward, but we had a question about what Dartmouth's plan to install EV chargers for commuters is on campus.
So glad someone else is going to answer this. I get a lot of these calls.
So we are, every time we go to kind of update a parking lot, resurface it, we're looking at opportunities to add EV chargers. I think it's going to be an ongoing process. This is another one that is not as easy as you would think, even in the new engineering and computer science building, getting the right kind of electrical setup, the fast chargers that everyone is kind of used to seeing, the Tesla ones that are on the highway, actually require quite a bit of infrastructure behind them. And so we're really, it takes some planning to do that effectively, but it's something that we're working on, and we're trying to add them bit by bit, and we'll certainly try and scale up our efforts in the coming years.
I just got to say, Josh and his husband are on a waiting list for a Rivian. I'm on a waiting list for
a real entry-level electric vehicle
and an F-150 Lightning. So we have a personal interest in making sure there
I
are
just
chargers.
want to charge my Kia Niro.
And our
Come on,
provost
people.
drives his Tesla to campus every day, so he has a personal interest. And my favorite thing in the safety and security report from this week was actually a safety and security officer who reported that a Kia had hooked up to a light pole.
It wasn't my Kia, just so you know.
You were worried, weren't you? So it's clear that if we're not building them, people are finding charging places
So a
anyway.
student had plugged into an outlet in a light pole. That's the best.
Literally.
That's the best thing I've ever heard. Jack.
Ask a quick follow-up.
Yeah, quick follow-up.
Along those lines, does the college have a plan to transform its own vehicle fleet to EVs? And what's the time frame on that?
I can't answer the time frame, but it is something that we're looking at and trying to figure out how to do.
And we have a first-year program group that is looking at transforming the S&S fleet. I have to say, I felt like it was kind of a landmark moment in sustainability when the safety and security fleet came to us and said, we really want to go all electric. I felt like that was like a big moment.
They just wanted new cars.
They want Teslas is what they want.
But, you know, the other thing that we need to work on, and interestingly, I've tried to get the president interested in this because the lawn mowers, which are pretty nasty sources of emissions for our landscaping, drive him crazy with noise when he's trying to have meetings. I'm like, Phil, you know, there are electric lawnmowers we could buy. And so there's another element of our fleet that we could work on.
We are actively looking at it. I think we will stop there. Thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you very much to our panelists, both for being here and also for all the hard work you're doing on sustainability. There is plenty more food, I think, outside, and we would like you to eat it. So please take some on your way out. Thank you very much. Happy Earth Day. Thank you.